All of the narratives presented herein are intended solely for entertainment purposes. I terminated my engagement with my fiancé after she requested an open relationship prior to our marriage. Our relationship has a long history, extending back to our childhood. I apologize for the length of this account. Jan and I had been friends since our childhood, as our parents were lifelong friends. We grew up together and began dating during our teenage years. It seemed as though our families had more plans for us than we did for ourselves. When I pursued my master's degree, I had to relocate to another city, while Jen remained in our hometown to pursue her nursing degree. After a year of long-distance separation, we decided to remain friends and not let the pressure of our relationship control us. We both valued our friendship and dated other people during that time. It was odd because deep down we always knew we would eventually end up back together. Once I graduated, I stayed in the city where I obtained my master's degree and began working in my field. I eagerly awaited a transfer back to my hometown, and when it finally came through, I was thrilled. Jen was in along. We opted to maintain a friendship despite the challenges of our relationship. We both placed value on our friendship and pursued romantic interests elsewhere. It was an unconventional arrangement, but we were confident that we would eventually reunite. Once I had completed my master's degree, I remained in the city where I had studied and began working in my field. I eagerly anticipated a transfer back to my hometown, and when it finally materialized, I was delighted. Jen was in a long-term relationship with a suitable partner. I was in a long-term relationship with a gentleman who was kind and considerate. Despite my awareness that he was somewhat cautious about our friendship, I respected his relationship and therefore took a step back. However, Jen and I continued to communicate on several occasions each year. My superior and mentor, whom I will refer to as Paul, was a remarkable individual. We developed a strong friendship, during which he instructed me on the essentials of the job. One day, he came down from his office to have a discussion with me. He informed me that there was an open position in a foreign city for a period of 2 years. He then proceeded to delineate the specifics of the position, noting that while the remuneration was not exorbitant, it would cover all pertinent expenses including accommodation, transportation, and other miscellaneous costs. I would be based in Tokyo but would occasionally be required to travel to other Asian cities for brief periods. I considered this opportunity, discussed it with my friends and parents, and Paul observed that it was a challenging position but an excellent opportunity for me to demonstrate my capabilities and advance my career. I considered the opportunity and decided to accept it. I could save most of my salary and gain valuable experience. Paul offered to recommend me to the higher-ups, sharing that he had done something similar in the past and it had greatly benefited his career. Therefore, I decided to proceed with the position. The first year was challenging, as I had to adjust to the culture and social norms not just in Japan but in the other countries I visited for work. One surprising aspect was how open women were to dating foreigners everywhere. I proceeded to visit several countries where I engaged in casual relationships with locals. I made it clear to all of them that I was not interested in anything long-term or marriage, as I was only staying temporarily. Consequently, I extended my stay for 2 additional years. Paul visited several times a year, either on vacation or to oversee some work. I must admit that we had some enjoyable experiences in a few cities, including Angeles City and the Philippines. After the conclusion of my contract, I returned to my place of origin and made a substantial initial payment on a property situated just outside the city. Having resided in a metropolis of 37 million inhabitants, I found myself in need of a more spacious residence. I remained at my familial residence for approximately a month. During this period, I engaged in more profound discussions with Jen, which led to the rekindling of our romantic relationship. Jen and I had previously terminated our romantic involvement a year prior. Despite maintaining contact over the intervening period, we had not been in a committed relationship. However, we eventually resumed our romantic involvement. I was reluctant to develop a close relationship with Jen because I was genuinely afraid of the consequences. I had developed a habit of being with multiple partners while I was in Asia, and I was trying to gain control over my desires before things got serious with January. Everyone, including Jan, was aware that I had been dating, and there were occasional photos of me with different women on social media. My mother even jokingly called me a ladies' man on a few occasions. To be candid, this assessment was not entirely inaccurate. This is where the narrative takes a turn. Jan and I finally engaged in sexual intercourse, and she was genuinely surprised. She observed that I was different from before and that observation was positive. She inquired about my experience, and I must admit that I did not disclose the exact number of sexual partners I had had because even if you divided it by 3, the number remained considerable. Despite my initial reservations, I was confident that I could maintain fidelity to her. However, the unintentional introduction of doubt by the night ultimately led to significant challenges. Our families were delighted by the prospect of our union, which had long been anticipated. After consulting with her parents, I decided to propose. She relocated to my residence, and our relationship appeared to be progressing well. However, I identified several potential concerns, including in December 2019, our wedding was scheduled for June 2020. As is well known, the year 2020 unfolded in a manner that was not entirely favorable. The Christmas period was a source of joy, but as the new year approached, we encountered our first significant challenge in our relationship. I was seated at my computer, working, while Jen and her cousin Tammy, whom I had known since childhood, were engaged in wedding-related activities. Jen requested a conversation, and Tammy joined us in the living room. I took a seat on the sofa and moved to the table to commence our conversation. She commenced by requesting that I refrain from interrupting her and wished to discuss a matter. She then proceeded to discuss our differences in the bedroom, expressing her concern that I might not be satisfied with her and could potentially engage in infidelity. She did not want our future and the lives of our children to be jeopardized if I were to stray. I began to worry that she was going to terminate our relationship just when I thought things were improving. The situation could not have been more dire. It felt like a bad infomercial with the famous line, "But wait, there's more." Jen surprised me by proposing that we open our relationship. She believed it would help her gain more experience and reduce her insecurities. She assured me not to worry because I was the only man she had ever loved, which was why none of her past relationships had led to marriage. I agreed with her on that point because I felt the same way at first. I thought she must be joking. I was incredulous and uncertain as to whether she was joking or being serious. This was a year and a half ago, so I will do my best to remember the main details. Jen explained that she would only be with random people, never with someone we knew or worked with. She also said that it wouldn't happen with the same person more than once and that there would be no emotional connections. I was completely shocked when I realized she was serious. My heart raced and I was at a loss for words. I was not an angry or violent person, but at this point I was yelling. I began to understand why Tammy was nearby. I yelled, accusing Tammy of putting Jen up to this, but Tammy claimed she was just there to support Jen. Jen then suggested that I could have the same freedom under the same rules, but I declined. I was furious, and even now, recalling this, I am still enraged. I explained that I did not want one-night stands, I wanted a committed relationship with one person. I was asked who I looked at, and I replied that I wanted to be with Tammy. This response shocked Jen, who was not expecting it. Tammy blushed and felt uncomfortable. Jen immediately refused, stating that Tammy was family and that it was inappropriate for me to suggest it. It seemed as though I had entered an entirely bizarre world, where this was suddenly a possibility. We argued back and forth for a while, and I made it clear that if she went through with this, our relationship would be over. I love her, but I am completely against this. I informed her that if she did not cease and desist, our relationship would be over. I was adamantly opposed to this course of action and loved her deeply. However, I was unable to reconcile the situation. I stormed off, grabbed my pillow, and went to the guest room. I could hear their conversation downstairs for a while, and it would have been amusing if it had not continued for an hour. I was unable to sleep that night and was a wreck at work the next day. Jen was starting her 2-night shift that day, so at least we would not be at home together during this time. During this period, it was necessary for both of us to take time to cool down before we could revisit this issue. She left dinner for me in the fridge every day, along with an "I love you" note. She texted me frequently, but I kept my responses short. One Thursday night, during her night shift week, I was working on my computer when I noticed an email notification on her account. It turned out to be a hotel reservation at a nice hotel close to my office, a place I knew well from outings with colleagues. I considered the possibility that she wished to apologize and take me out for a night. I awaited her text or call to invite me, but she merely inquired about my day. She then mentioned how happy she was that she only had one more night of the night shift. I was perplexed, as I was unsure how she had one more night reserved at the hotel. I felt ill and stressed at my office. I began to search online dating sites, specifically profiles without images, in the hope of identifying any evidence of wrongdoing. A colleague named Paul observed that I was visibly distressed and inquired if I wished to have lunch. He had consistently supported my relationship with Jen. I confided in him about the situation and he suggested we have lunch at a hotel restaurant. I immediately declined. He was not aware of that particular aspect of the situation and thus he was reluctant to proceed. We went for lunch, but I was unable to eat and was not even interested in drinking. Paul informed me that I could not continue working in this manner and offered to assist me in taking as much leave as I needed, whether paid or unpaid. I informed him that I could not bear to be at home anymore and that I could not shake the feeling that what I was hearing was not true. I then left. I proceeded to pack up as much of my belongings as I could fit in my car and return to the office. Paul then proposed that we stake out the hotel and await her arrival. I am not a private investigator or detective, I felt more akin to Inspector Clouseau. I was genuinely reluctant, but I was compelled to obtain answers. Consequently, we established ourselves in the lounge bar and I commenced consuming alcohol in significant quantities. I was still hopeful that this was not a genuine occurrence when the clock struck 6. At this point, Paul tapped me on the shoulder and there she was at the front desk, not in her uniform. I was overcome with a range of emotions including anger, frustration, and sadness. I wanted to scream, yell, or cry. We waited for approximately 10 minutes after she got into the elevator and Paul and I walked to the front desk. I asked the receptionist to connect me to Jen's room and the call connected immediately. I began shouting into the receiver and she appeared confused. I informed her that if she did this, our relationship would be over. I then terminated the call and left the hotel in a hurry. I was unsure of my next course of action. I returned to Paul's place and my phone began to ring incessantly. I only contacted my father and I informed him of the situation in a private conversation. I proceeded to explain the situation in a calm and rational manner, stating that I needed to leave town for a while. I made it clear that this was not open for discussion and that I regretted how I had spoken to my father. My phone continued to ring for 2 days, with numerous calls from various individuals. However, I chose not to answer, as I was unsure of the best course of action. The only way I can describe my feelings at the time is akin to walking through water. Paul mentioned some financial matters that I should take care of to protect myself. At the time, I was not even thinking about that. The house, the wedding, the car loans, we had separate accounts for everything. One was for the wedding and one for house-related expenses. I was not concerned about it. The next day, I sent an email to Jan, telling her that I informed her that I was leaving the city for a while and that the wedding and everything else were off. I then called my father back and spoke to him at length. He was understandably upset, as he had recently overdosed. I told him that I needed time and space and that I hoped we could still work things out. 10 days later, I boarded a plane and left. I proceeded to Bali, where I did not respond to any of Jen's or anyone else's messages or emails. I did not even care if I was fired. While I wish I could say that I had a good time, I was mostly just drunk. I experienced a great deal of anger, shame, and resentment about how things unfolded. I stayed in touch with Paul regarding my leave, and after 3 weeks, he asked if I was able to return to Tokyo to address certain matters that had been discussed. These included the new global virus and the possibility of returning to Canada due to rumors of potential lockdowns. I arrived in Tokyo on the 1st of March and it was reassuring to be back at work, even if it was only for a short period. I subsequently learned about the impending lockdowns. He advised me to return to Canada, but I was adamant about remaining in Japan until May, reasoning that it would only be a matter of 30 or 60 days. I needed time to plan my next steps. However, 30 to 60 days proved to be insufficient, and I ended up staying in Japan for another year before being vaccinated. By that time, I had lost interest in returning home, as my house was rented out and I was settled in. I attempted to maintain contact with my family but was unable to obtain any information about Jen on the 21st of September. I subsequently received news that my father had suffered a heart attack. He was recovering well but required a triple bypass operation, which is a serious procedure but not as dire as it used to be. I wished to see him just in case, aware that when I returned home, the situation might become complicated. I was reluctant to visit, as I was concerned about the potential for conflict. I wanted to express my gratitude to Paul for his support, despite my past behavior. I was unsure how I would feel or what to expect. I apologize for the length of this message. I omitted a great deal of information. I would be grateful for any advice, tips or criticisms. I would be grateful for any advice or feedback. I am currently en route to my destination and I will arrive in approximately 24 hours. Upon landing, I proceeded to visit my father, who appeared to be in good spirits and was eagerly awaiting his upcoming surgery. My mother, on the other hand, seemed to be hiding her true feelings. I spent the majority of the first 24 hours by my father's side, and we engaged in a wide range of topics, including. We discussed a wide range of topics, though nothing too distressing. I reassured him that I was there for him, but that I was also using this trip to reorganize my life and close some doors and open some new ones. I had already had a few drinks with him, and we discussed my father's work. He even asked if I had any contact with Jen. Responded with a negative, to which I replied. He then mentioned that the boss, the elderly gentleman, wished to see me. However, in consideration of my father's circumstances, I proposed that we defer the meeting. Nevertheless, I am aware that I am in a difficult situation, and thus I consented to meet with him. I have a list of tasks that I must complete this month, and I may as well begin to cross them off. Meeting Jen is one of these tasks. Among my priorities, I entered the office for the first time in what felt like a long time. Many familiar faces were missing, and there were a few new ones. Among the usual suspects, some people nodded and greeted me as we headed up to the old man's office, a place I had never been before. When we walked in, he gestured for us to take a seat. I had never interacted with the old man before. He does make appearances on the floor from time to time, and people part like the Red Sea when he does. Here is how our conversation unfolded. Old man: good morning, gentlemen. This is a closed meeting, and anything discussed here is private. The old man launched into a monologue about responsibility and dedication. I have to admit that he made some valid points. He then turned to Paul and asked why they should keep me on board. Paul chimed in, saying that I do great work and have saved accounts and acquired many new ones. He said that they cannot find anyone to do the job for the 20% below market salary that they are offering. He proceeded to deliver a monologue on the importance of responsibility and dedication. While I concede that his arguments were not entirely without merit, I must also acknowledge that he made some questionable assertions. He then turned to Paul and inquired as to why they should retain my services. Paul interjected, stating that I had performed commendable work, having saved numerous accounts and acquired new ones. He further argued that they could not find anyone willing to do the job for the 20% below market salary that they were offering. The remuneration package was deemed to be inadequate. Paul and the senior executive burst into maniacal laughter, reminiscent of a scene from a classic film. The senior executive wiped away a tear from his eye and commended Paul as the best vice president he had ever worked with. I looked at the senior executive and he leaned in, as if to say that I had been somewhat overlooked. He informed me that he had encountered a man who was able to offer advice on the subject of relationships. He mentioned a particular individual by name, although I do not recall the exact words he used. The essence of his advice was that a woman is given certain characteristics by God, and that she is then free to alter them at her discretion. The woman is dissatisfied with her form and seeks to alter it through the purchase of slim-fitting clothes. If God himself cannot please her, it is unclear how a brother can do so. This line of reasoning struck me as somewhat unconventional. The old man conveyed that he could trust me to handle this properly and mentioned that his mother would kill him if he had to fire me suddenly. This information led me to conclude that Paul and I were related. We walked out together and I inquired about the 20%, asking if it was accurate. He put his arm around me and he reassured me that I should not be concerned, stating that he would take care of the matter. I inquired whether I was facing termination or some form of disciplinary action. Paul responded by calling me a dumbass and stating that I was being promoted. He put his arm around me and kissed me on the side of the head. I expressed my frustration that he could have informed me beforehand. Paul laughed and said that the entire night had been much more enjoyable this way. He mentioned how he missed me and called me kid, suggesting that we go get breakfast. I commented on the early hour and questioned who eats breakfast at 8 a.m. At 30 minutes past midnight, he informed me that he does indeed enjoy life and that I still have much to learn in this regard. He added that it did not surprise him, given my past actions, to hear that I had once become inebriated on sake and engaged in a physical altercation with a monkey at the hot springs in Japan. I ultimately suffered the consequences of my actions. We ended up having a great time, talking about work and other topics. We discussed Yang and he advised me that I should arrange to meet her in order to gain closure. He said that we both did foolish things, but that we are good people. Once I gain closure, I will be able to move forward in my future without an emotional anchor holding me back. He said that once that is resolved, we can then discuss my employment future. That particular issue has now been resolved. Nevertheless, I am still gainfully employed. My father's situation appears promising. However, I am still preoccupied with the matter of Jan, which has been a persistent source of concern. I have unblocked her on Facebook and perused her profile to prepare myself for what is to come. I sent her a private message inquiring if we could meet for dinner at her earliest convenience. She responded cordially and agreed to meet for dinner in the next few days. My next update concerns my meeting with Jan at a restaurant a few hours after she finished work. I was concerned that my anger might remain and that I might act accordingly, or that my love for her might remain and that I might act accordingly. I was hoping to find a comfortable middle ground in the grey area, but as soon as she walked through the door, all my plans were rendered irrelevant. The woman in question looked wonderful, smiled, and walked over. My stomach was in my throat. I was not this nervous when we lost our virginity together. We shared a short, awkward hug, and I could smell my favorite perfume on her. Was she about to express great affection for me or play some emotional tricks? Was she in another relationship and here to show me what I missed? There were no rings on her finger. Even the one I gave her, we discussed my father first. She informed me that she always checked in on him when she was on shift and assured me that the surgeon for the upcoming bypass was one of the best. We then engaged in small talk, discussing her extreme workload during the pandemic and what I experienced being locked down in Tokyo. I was on the verge of breaking down, but managed to maintain composure. On the surface, she appeared calm and collected. However, I was experiencing significant emotional distress. I believed that this conversation was necessary to address my emotions and to facilitate my recovery. It seemed that we had been avoiding addressing the underlying issue for an extended period. Then, she looked at me and her expression changed. The remainder of the conversation is somewhat hazy, but I will do my best to recall it. Jen expressed remorse. She expressed remorse for what had occurred and for causing me pain. I questioned her sincerity, asking if she was sorry for being caught or genuinely remorseful for the harm inflicted on me. She insisted that she was sorry for the pain it caused me and for what it did to our lives, our relationships, and our future. I probed further, wondering if her actions were driven by insecurity or a desire to punish me for the people I associated with when we weren't yet engaged. A couple of instances she admitted that it could be both, but she wanted to convey that any other man in her life before we were engaged she never loved like she loved me. Later, she brought up her ex-partner Tim, who had cheated on her, feeling inadequate compared to her feelings for me. I confess that I was unaware of this, and to be honest, I did not feel bad that he had cheated. I just did not want her to know that I was going to sleep with another man. I thought I could emotionally detach from it, and even if she found out, I could work through it like we did with everything else before. I reflected on the situation and added that she was wrong. It was probably the most painful thing I had ever experienced. I did not need her to be perfect or experienced. I just needed her to be mine. None of them could ever measure up to what I felt with her, but now I am starting to wonder if it was a genuine feeling. I advised her to detach from this situation and, if she were to discover my infidelity, to work through it as we had done with previous instances of infidelity. I added that she was mistaken in her assumption that I would be unfaithful to her. I informed her that the experience had been the most painful of my life. I did not require her to be perfect or experienced, I simply needed her to be mine. I informed her that none of the other women in my life could ever measure up to the feelings I had for her. However, I am now questioning whether my feelings for her were genuine. Was it a genuine feeling, or merely a consequence of the aspirations our families had for us, or the expectations we had placed on ourselves? The conversation began to become emotionally charged, and Jen excused herself to go to the restroom to collect herself. We were in a moderately sized restaurant with only a few occupied tables. Paul was with us for support, as some of you had suggested, and he strategically positioned himself in the separate lounge area. I looked over for some I was seeking encouragement or a thumbs up, but to my surprise, he was deeply engaged in an animated conversation with two attractive ladies, laughing and gesturing enthusiastically. He finally glanced over and gave me an inquisitive thumbs up, and I nodded to signal that everything was okay. He responded with a smile and then flipped me the middle finger before returning to his other activities. "This guy is seriously messed up," Jen returned, and we resumed our conversation. Our conversation then turned to the subject of my previous night's activities. I informed Jen that I wished to inquire about a particular matter, but that it was now beyond my control. I added that I was reassured by Jen's assertion that nothing had actually occurred. I then informed Jen that I was leaving the room, which caused her to rush down to the lobby. However, I had already departed. I then reiterated that the matter was now closed and that I wished to move on from it. In order to focus on moving forward, I asked Jen if she could forgive me. I added that, of course, I could forgive her and that I did forgive her. She is not a terrible person, she simply made a series of unfortunate choices that led us to this point. It is not entirely her fault, and I acknowledge that I should have been more open to understanding her concerns as well. During this conversation, I experienced a range of emotions, including love, anger, and regret. Part of me wanted I was torn between two opposing impulses. On the one hand, I was filled with a desire to unleash my frustration upon her, and on the other, I was driven by a compelling urge to offer her solace and support. In the weeks preceding this conversation, I had been perusing YouTube videos on Reddit that depicted men inflicting self-punishment for the far more egregious infidelities their partners had committed. I was resolved not to become one of those men. I gazed at her, contemplating the elderly man's words about the superficial aspects of appearance, such as painted faces and manicured nails. Appropriate attire was a key factor in my assessment of her character. Did I truly know her? Was her outward appearance indicative of her inner self? Did her mind reflect her outward appearance? I was overcome with self-reflection. What now? Is there anything in the future for us? She recalled a childhood memory, mentioning that she wanted me to remember when we were kids walking home from the park and a vicious dog approached us. She instinctively got in front of me to protect me, to save me. The owner called the dog back, and it ran away. It was only a matter of seconds elapsed, but when one is 9 years of age, such a situation can be perceived as frightening. I responded that, despite the passage of time, I still stood in front of her, offering her love and protection from the vicissitudes of life. However, on this occasion, when I stood in front of her, offering her my full support, she stabbed me in the back, just as the frog stabs the frog in the tail of the scorpion. My words had a profound impact on her, and she lowered her head, shedding a few tears. I was not yet finished, and I needed to express everything. I continued telling Jan that I was sorry for the way she had taken things. I removed the item from the ring box and slid it across the table to the other party. I informed them that I did not wish to accept it. I was visibly upset. I inquired as to whether they believed I wanted to remain in the situation, with my heart pounding and her crying. I expressed my desire to be home, playing with the baby, and stated that we should have had the child by now. I could not recall much of what was said in the next few minutes, as the other party began sobbing and covering her face with her hands. I acknowledged that I had said hurtful things in my life, but that this particular statement was the most hurtful of them all. I apologized for my actions and acknowledged that I had gone too far. This helped me to overcome my initial anger, and the remainder of our conversation was conducted in a more composed and rational manner. After I had expressed my frustrations, we engaged in a more conventional discussion about life and the future. It was evident that reconciliation was no longer a viable option when she stood to leave. We embraced each other for a considerable length of time, and I will conclude this account here, with the promise of returning to it tomorrow. The preceding days have been challenging, and I am grateful for the opportunity to share this story. I will now move on to another, equally intriguing narrative. Stay tuned and let us embark on the next adventure together. I was cheated on after a 4-year relationship. The relationship in question commenced 4 years ago, when my girlfriend, who was 24 at the time, and I, also 24, began our romantic involvement. She had recently emerged from a previous abusive relationship, both mentally and physically. I played a supportive role in helping her heal during that time, and we grew very close. The idea of her cheating on me seemed unimaginable. Throughout our relationship, we engaged in numerous discussions about infidelity. We both held the firm belief that cheating is not a solution to any problem. Instead, we believed in open communication. I placed my trust in her completely because she had never shown any interest in other men while we were together. However, over the past year, she became somewhat distant and started engaging in activities that were not consistent with our relationship. In the course of our relationship, I was unaware of her interest in clubbing. Initially, she would go to clubs with her best friend, claiming that she wanted to dance. I informed her that clubbing was not my preference and that I did not wish to attend solely to serve as her bodyguard. At the time, I did not consider this a significant issue, assuming that she and her friend could handle any unwanted attention. However, after a few weeks, I observed that she had received a message from a person named Chris, whose name I have changed for reasons of privacy. When she mentioned his name, I was struck by the coincidence, so I inquired about it. She informed me that a random individual had complimented her appearance and requested her number, which she provided, citing that she was intoxicated at the time. This incident prompted my suspicions, leading to a confrontation. I believed she was only going to the clubs to have fun with a friend, albeit naively. Our argument escalated, with her accusing me of being overly jealous and controlling. My point was that she might not have control over her actions when drunk, and I worried about her safety in such situations. It was possible that she might be taken advantage of by men. After the fight, we made up, but there was still some resentment. She began to accuse me of being judgmental whenever she shared sensitive information. At this time, I started secretly checking her messages. She continued to chat with the guy from the club, but it seemed mostly harmless, just occasional. Every few weeks or so, he initiated casual conversation, jumping ahead to a few days ago. It had been a while since I last checked her messages. I thought our relationship was on a good path, as I consistently invested time and effort into it. She still appeared somewhat distant, but she explained it as stress and fatigue from her university classes and work. I believed her. I was also experiencing the effects of these responsibilities, but I assumed that everyone had different stress levels. However, one night while she was asleep, I could not resist the temptation to view her messages. I discovered a recent conversation with Chris, the same individual from the previous night when I had presumed she had retired early at 3 a.m. 0 a.m. midnight. She was sending him images of herself at the club, claiming that she was intoxicated. I was filled with a sense of rage, yet I did not confront her immediately. I continued to scroll through her messages and discovered another chat with an anonymous individual. Their conversations appeared to be of an intimate nature, though not overtly explicit. This prompted me to revisit the beginning of their conversation, which took place 3 months prior. At the outset of their discourse, approximately 3 months prior, she had provided this gentleman with her contact information following their initial encounter on the street. Subsequently, she informed him to maintain secrecy regarding their intimate activities. This was the moment I lost my composure. I awoke her and inquired if she would confess to infidelity. She replied in the affirmative. After a brief interval of silence, she requested her mobile phone. I handed it to her and she departed the room in a huff. Since then, she has elucidated the events of that fateful night. She consumed a considerable quantity of alcohol with a friend at her residence. She was experiencing a sense of despondency regarding our relationship, believing that she lacked the capacity to communicate with me and that I did not allocate sufficient time for her, despite my efforts to spend time with her whenever possible. She embarked on a solitary walk. That night, she sent the man a message. She then proceeded to his residence, where she kissed him, embraced him, and slept in his arms. At least, that is what she revealed to me. She is currently attempting to reconcile with me, professing her love and vowing that it will never happen again. She has informed me that she is willing to seek therapy and put effort into repairing our relationship and mending all that is broken between us. I am becoming more inclined to believe her, but I remain uncertain about whether I can continue this relationship. Given that we were progressing towards cohabitation, marriage and other future plans while she was concealing this information from me, I am unsure whether I should give her a second chance. Should I set aside my pride and rekindle the relationship? I would like to thank you all for your advice and support. I have decided to sever all contact with her because I do not want to live in fear and trauma alongside her. I hope that things will gradually become easier from here on out.